Welcome back to the Poplar Report. The world has become a much more dangerous place out there. The United States military, once the most powerful in the world, and arguably still the most powerful in the world, however, has failed to adapt to the change in the world. Just as we failed to adapt to 9/11 and the changing tactics of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, we have underestimated our enemies once again, as China and Russia have now sought to displace the United States, to put the United States and its European allies in its place. They have examined the battlefield, they have examined our weaknesses, and they have found that there are ways that they can compete with us that we are unprepared to handle. We are at war, even if we do not recognize it as such. China has already admitted as much, that we are in the early opening scenes of war. That in their minds, it's not war or no war, but rather it is a series of kinds of war that we're in, and we are currently in a gray zone war with them. That is how they have stated it. They have laid out how they can defeat the United States, and we are in the first opening round. They are using tactics and strategies that can impact the United States homeland right now. Let's jump into some of these strategies that they're using that basically makes our vast Air Force, our highly, they just can't compete with the technology and the how fast our Air Force is, how powerful our radar is, but they are investing into certain technologies and certain strategies in order to make sure that our Navy ships, our aircraft, our tanks are just not useful. If they attack us in certain ways, we become extremely vulnerable. Let's go over some of these. The first one is something we've talked about before, cyber attacks. And we see these things regularly happening. Russia is particularly adept at doing this against all sorts of European targets, but also against the United States as well. There are different kinds of cyber attacks, of course. There is the cheap denial of service attacks, where they just hijack a whole bunch of internet devices and just have them all like spam certain websites and can take websites offline, which can be a real nuisance and an inconvenience, of course. It's annoying, but it's more for propaganda. However, information theft, getting into network systems and start stealing information, particularly concerning are when they do this and they go into the systems and they steal passwords, they steal access information so that they can go back in and do something even worse. Then there's ransomware. We've been hit by this already. The Columbia pipeline was shut down by ransomware. And we've also had other infrastructure attacked in this way, where basically the files get encrypted on the hard drives and basically threatened with deleting if you don't pay the ransom. And even if you pay the ransom, maybe they get deleted anyway. There's no real telling. But if the purpose of the ransomware is in order to lock up everyone's computer systems so that they cannot function, especially when this is hospitals. We've seen that before, pipelines, when we see this attacking infrastructure targets. We've seen all of these attacks already, ransomware attacks, and they look like people just trying to make some money, some criminals trying to steal some money, but maybe they are actually backed up by the state. Now, it is important to kind of just point out here, because, just as we were getting shot at with our own missiles over in Afghanistan, we're kind of getting shot at with our own cyber warfare weapons that we've developed. There was a release of a bunch of the tools that the CIA, as well as other agencies, defense agencies, have been using to attack other targets, variants of the Stuxnet viruses that got out into the open. And some of these powerful cyber weapons have been repurposed and targeted back at us. Of course, that type of high-level cyber warfare weapons, even the redesign of those weapons often probably has to be done by a nation state like China, Russia, not North Korea, because they don't really have too many computers, if you know what I mean. But all of these attacks, but then there's the straight out infrastructure attacks where they go in and they just start flipping switches. They've tried to harden the United States power grid against an attack of this type, and they say that it can't be done. But we know that the pipelines are still affected. We know that sensors all along things that are still operating on computer systems that can be hacked and overtaken. Pretty much most systems out there that are run by computers can eventually be hacked if you know how they work, if you know how to get into them, and sometimes if you are able to access them directly. And of course, when we're talking about state actors like China, Russia, they can get people in the United States. The apprehensions of Chinese nationals crossing the southern border, because that never happens, is up 700% this year. So, I mean, not saying that they're necessarily nefarious, but you got to ask the question, why are Chinese nationals crossing our southern border? Is that nefarious? Is that a potential lead up to an attack on the United States? We don't know who's coming in. We don't know who's coming in. Low-tech balloon attacks. So that's all the rage out there. Now, I'm not saying that all the balloons that have been shot down and the objects that have been shot down are actually balloons. Maybe they might be radio reflectors used by amateur radio folks. If you're in the preparedness community, you might have your amateur radio license, and you kind of know sort of what that's about. A reflector that we put up in the sky so we can bounce signals off of it. And it's basically just a foil balloon. Apparently that may have been what was shot down over Lake Huron, somewhere between a $12 balloon and maybe up to a $600 balloon, depending on what kind of tech was on it. But, you know, $1 million worth of missiles used against it. But this is more serious than that. And this is why this is so serious. Our entire military's buildup is designed to take down highly expensive jet aircraft that are trying to compete with the United States for stealth technology. So they've got the search radars. They're looking for fast-moving. All of our ground radar stations are built the same way. They're looking for fast-moving jet aircraft that are flying high or flying low or whatever, but they're not looking for little balloons that kind of float along. And why is that important? One, because we had trouble shooting down that balloon. Now, if you have a $500,000 missile on a $300 million aircraft, backed up by another $300 million aircraft, and it's going off the radar signals off of, the F-15s that are nearby too, and you're having trouble shooting something down, is that a warning that should be heard? That we've built a military full of sophisticated toys that are designed against a certain kind of threat, and then when the enemy starts doing something completely different that we're not prepared for, and we don't have missile systems, we don't have weapon systems designed to deal with this, and radar systems designed to detect these things. We couldn't track that balloon, that Chinese balloon, because it didn't have much of a radar cross-section. Now, the balloons that we've been blowing out of the sky that are foil, they're designed to reflect radio signals, okay? That's why they're a little bit easier to shoot down and such. But when we're talking about balloons that don't necessarily have metal in them, it's very difficult for our radars to detect them. And you say, Steve, you're being paranoid. Am I? Because 6 just appeared over Kiev. Wait, what? Yes. Bear Country has started floating radar reflective balloons over the combat area in order to confuse and overwhelm air defenses. So there they are, over in the eastern country that we're not allowed to talk about. They're shooting $400,000 missiles, and they're wanting Patriot missiles so they can fire $4 million missiles at $200 balloons? Do you see a problem with that? I mean, If you're an American taxpayer, you see a problem with that. If you're from Eastern Europe, you're just like, just give us more missiles, you know? But do you see a problem how maybe Russia might be able to come up with more $200 balloons? As they start deploying lots and lots of balloons over the combat area, suddenly air defenses seem a little bit, you know, like they're not going to work. Because they can't differentiate between all these radar signatures all over the sky. You see how we've become so technologically adept that we're just stupid. And our enemies are figuring out those ways. We're making an AI robot that's supposed to be a sentry, and they had Marines kind of test it to see if they could kind of dupe it. And the Marines got themselves into a cardboard box and walked up to it. And they couldn't detect them. And that's kind of the situation where we're in right now, where we're just not thinking counter-insurgency. And yet our enemies are doing that very thing. They can deploy hundreds or thousands of radar-reflecting drone balloons to overwhelm our air defenses. They can send in non-reflective balloons to carry payloads in. If they start doing that, that's a big problem that we have. We also have the problem of moving on to China has built this system called the Club K missiles. Basically, they've taken a shipping container and they put a missile battery, a retractable missile battery into it. Now, you can just take that shipping container and put it on any ship you put a shipping container on. Now, are there a lot of ships with shipping containers out there? There are absolutely a lot of ships with shipping containers. Tons of them. And the fact is, imagine you are the U.S. military with your aircraft carrier and you're detecting ships out there and you see a cargo ship and you confirm that it's a cargo ship. Well, what happens if that container was marked sausages for the bound for the United States? Maybe even the cargo ship doesn't even, or the captain of the ship doesn't even know that this is actually a weapon system, and suddenly it activates. Somehow they figure out to make sure that they put that on the top stack of the shipping containers, and this shipping container suddenly opens up, fires anti-ship missiles directly at our aircraft carrier from point blank range from a non-combatant ship, and it's not even necessarily a hostile ship. Then they just can take these shipping containers and put them on anything that floats and make lots and lots of ships. They can be even unmanned ships. All they need to do is just make it big enough to float and put a shipping container on it. Every single ship in the Chinese fleet suddenly became a missile cruiser. Do you see a problem with that? Do you see why our $20 billion aircraft carriers suddenly could become very obsolete very quickly unless we're willing to sink everything in the sea? More than that, China has now mobilized a fleet of what's called Maritime Militia. And what they've done is they've built fishing ships, but then they've staffed them with party loyal, full-time paid people who are not paid to fish, but are paid to take their ships into disputed territory and ram other ships. Conveniently, they've reinforced the bows. They're not military ships. They're not combatants. They're not part of the Navy, but they're staffed with people who have been trained, kind of like the Navy, and they're paid by the state to basically go around and ram any ships that get into their disputed territory. They've also mobilized all their resources to turn multiple islands in the disputed South China Sea into missile platforms and air bases. They've basically created islands, made them into air bases, and stacked them full of missile batteries. This is the kind of thing that we're dealing with that we just aren't prepared for. We're not thinking outside the box, and yet our enemies are. I've said it repeatedly, and I'll say it again. I believe that World War III, we will lose, and we will lose badly, and very, very quickly, potentially, because our enemies are in a state of war with us, and we are not ready for it. There's a lot of things to consider. World War III may not go well for the United States and its allies. Even though we've been the big kids on the block for so long, we've been the lone superpower, the problem is our enemies have been able to examine all of our weaknesses, and they've been able to exploit them, and now they are getting ready to fully exploit them. What's going on in Eastern Europe is really them learning new strategies to deal with U.S. and European weapon systems. These balloons that just showed up over the conflict zone, you just wait. That is not something that's going to go away. They're using cheap drones. We're firing $400,000 missiles at their $20,000 Iranian drones. Every time we win, we lose. And that's the type of situation where it seems almost inevitable that we will lose. Unless we can change our thinking, unless we can seriously deal with the threats that are around us. How could we possibly do that? Very simply. I'm not saying easily. Simply taking U.S. Navy SEALs and putting them on all of the boards that make decisions on purchasing of weapon systems and planning and strategic planning on how to fight. Put Navy SEALs who actually have combat experience, who understand counterinsurgency, who understand how to fight a guerrilla war so they can anticipate what's going to happen. Every time that they do a drill or a practice, whiteboarding and mapping out, they do a force exercise, the United States against China, China keeps winning. We're just going to put that right on the table there. Every time we do a force exercise, China keeps winning. This is by U.S. military planners. And you'd think that we'd be kind of stacking the deck against them. And yet they keep putting insurgency, guerrilla warfare kind of mentality people in the seat of the Chinese, and they keep beating us because we cannot cope with that. We've lost that ability to adapt and overcome. In the Army, they need to get the Green Berets and they need to start putting them in positions where they're making decisions on what weapon systems are being purchased. What are the plans being made? Because we got a whole bunch of bureaucrats running the purchasing programs out there. The U.S. Air Force keeps trying to kill the A-10 Warthog, which is one of the best aircraft ever designed. And they want to replace it with what? F-35s. Super expensive fighters that are extremely fragile. They can't take off of an airbase that has been bombed. If an airfield that they're trying to take off from has been bombed, the whole place has to be cleaned. All the rubble has to be cleaned out so that they don't suck anything up into their engines. And you say, Steve, well, that's just how jets work. Well, that's not how jets work. If you go over to Bear Country, you look at their jets, you'll see all their fighter jets have flaps that close up over the intakes of their jets, and they have little flaps open up on the top that suck in air while they're cruising around on the ground that are on top of the fighter jet. The big scoops underneath close up. So nothing can get sucked into those engines. Because they're thinking, gee, in a real fight, our air base is going to be attacked. And there's going to be rubble and debris everywhere. So we can't have it so that our jet engines are sucking all that stuff in. We need to think our way around that. And they've been doing that for years. They have a lot of practical experience, and their engineering is much more thought through when it comes to combat than the United States and its allies. We're too pretty for the battlefield. And we've been able to hold our own against the likes of Iraq and Saddam Hussein. But when it's come to ragtag militias in Afghanistan, we've lost. when it's come to ragtag militias in Iraq, we've lost. And when we can't deal with insurgents, that doesn't spell well for us dealing with a major power or multiple major powers that are standing up against us. I don't want to discourage you. I just want you to understand the situation, that things could get ugly really fast, and the heroic, truly heroic, I'm not saying that ironically, the heroic, morally awesome American soldiers and Western allies may go out to defeat because we are not equipping them. We're not preparing them. We're not strategizing or thinking our way through. We're going to put them into harm's way and not support them the way they need to be. And that's a scary thing. I hope we can change. I hope we're hearing, I hope we're learning from what's happening over in Eastern Europe too. I hope it's not just the bad guys learning what's going on and how to defeat the United States. Hopefully we're learning their strategies and we're countering those strategies with other strategies. Hopefully we're on the ball. But given what I'm seeing out of Washington, D.C., I am not optimistic about that. All right, folks, if you guys have some thoughts about that, I'm sure you do. Pop them down in the comments down below and chat about them and let it, be kind to each other, right? We're all just kind of thinking through what's going to happen in the near future. If you found this video useful or helpful, you might want to check out another video from me right here. I'll see you over there, or I'll see you later. Steve Poplar, out.